Carl Jung discovered a terrifying truth about narcissists that could save your life. When they realize they can't control you anymore, they don't just walk away. They deploy one final devastating manipulation that Jung called manufactured vulnerability, a psychological weapon so sophisticated that it can destroy years of healing in a matter of weeks. Jung warned that this final dirty trick is the narcissist's most dangerous weapon because it weaponizes your greatest strength, your empathy, against your freedom. Right now, thousands of people who thought they had escaped narcissistic control are falling back into the trap because they don't recognize this final manipulation. But Jung didn't just identify this pattern. He discovered exactly how it works, why it's so effective, and most importantly, how to protect yourself from it. If you've ever wondered why narcissists seem to have a crisis every time you get stronger, this isn't coincidence. It's psychological warfare. Here's what's at stake. Everything you've worked to build, every boundary you've set, every moment of self-respect you've reclaimed, every step toward authentic living that you've fought for, all of it can be destroyed by this one manipulation if you don't see it coming. Carl Jung spent decades studying narcissistic personalities, and what he discovered will make your blood run cold. Narcissists don't just want to control you. They want to prove that your strength was always an illusion. They want to demonstrate that deep down, you're still the same person who needed them. Right now, you might think you're safe. You've set boundaries. You've recognized their gaslighting. You've learned about love bombing and manipulation tactics. But Jung discovered that traditional advice about narcissistic abuse misses the most dangerous phase. What happens when they realize you're truly becoming independent? This isn't about the obvious manipulations anymore. This is about a calculated psychological assault designed specifically for strong people who think they've figured it out. Jung called it the power inversion crisis, the moment when the narcissist realizes their victim has become psychologically stronger than they are. The cost of not recognizing this pattern isn't just falling back into old dynamics. It's losing faith in your own judgment, questioning your healing progress, and potentially abandoning the authentic life you've worked so hard to create. But when you understand Jung's insights about this final manipulation, something powerful happens. You don't just protect yourself, you complete your psychological liberation. You become truly unmanipulable. Let me tell you about the moment Carl Jung realized he was dealing with something far more sinister than ordinary selfishness. During his clinical work, Jung encountered a patient who seemed to be the perfect victim of narcissistic abuse. She had endured years of manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional warfare from her husband. But here's where Jung's story takes a disturbing turn. Every time this woman grew stronger, every time she made progress in therapy and started setting boundaries, her husband would have a mysterious crisis that pulled her right back in. Jung initially thought this was coincidence. Then he started seeing the pattern with other patients. The narcissists in their lives weren't just randomly falling apart. They were strategically creating crises that coincided perfectly with their victims' moments of strength. This led Jung to a shocking discovery about the narcissistic mind that most people never understand. Narcissists don't just want control, they need to prove their control. And the moment you start becoming truly independent, you become a threat to their entire psychological identity. Jung identified what he called the narcissistic supply hierarchy. At the bottom level, narcissists need attention, admiration, and validation. Most people understand this part, but Jung discovered there are deeper levels that are far more dangerous. At the middle level, narcissists need to feel superior. They accomplish this by keeping others confused, dependent, or struggling. When you are seeking their approval, questioning your own reality, or walking on eggshells around them, you are feeding this deeper need. But Jung discovered the most sinister level. Narcissists need to prove their dominance over strong people. Anyone can control someone who's already broken. But controlling someone who has fought their way to strength? That's the ultimate validation of their power. This is why narcissists often target empathetic, intelligent, successful people. It's not despite these qualities, it's because of them. Jung realized that narcissists are essentially power addicts, and strong people represent the highest quality supply they can obtain. Jung called this phenomenon strength hunting. Narcissists are unconsciously drawn to people who have something they lack: authentic self-worth, genuine empathy, real accomplishments. But instead of trying to develop these qualities themselves, they attempt to drain them from others. Here's where Jung's insight becomes truly chilling. Narcissists study strong people. They observe what makes you proud, what triggers your guilt, what activates your compassion. Jung discovered that narcissists are unconscious experts in psychological profiling. During your relationship with a narcissist, they weren't just enjoying your company. They were mapping your psychological landscape, identifying your emotional triggers, and cataloging your vulnerabilities. Jung called this shadow reconnaissance. The narcissist unconsciously gathers intelligence about your inner world that they can weaponize later. This is why the final dirty trick is so effective. It's not a random manipulation. It's a precisely targeted psychological assault based on months or years of observation. Jung discovered that narcissists have an almost supernatural ability to sense when you're becoming truly independent. It's not conscious awareness. It's more like a predator sensing that their prey is escaping, and that's when they deploy the manufactured vulnerability. But here's what Jung found most disturbing. Narcissists often don't realize they're doing this consciously. They genuinely experience the crisis they create. Jung called this unconscious sabotage. The narcissist's psyche literally creates real problems to maintain psychological control over their supply sources. This means you're not dealing with a conscious manipulator who's coldly calculating your downfall. You're dealing with someone whose unconscious mind is so desperate to maintain control that it will create genuine suffering for both of you to prevent your independence. Jung's first warning about this final manipulation is this: the more progress you make, the more severe their crisis will become. Because your strength isn't just threatening their control, it's threatening their entire sense of identity. Carl Jung made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about narcissistic relationships. There's a specific moment when the entire dynamic shifts, and if you don't recognize it, you'll be pulled back into psychological slavery without even realizing what happened. Jung called this the power inversion crisis, the moment when the narcissist realizes that you've become psychologically stronger than they are. And what happens next follows such a predictable pattern that Jung was able to map it like a psychological formula. During Jung's research, he documented hundreds of cases where people thought they had successfully escaped narcissistic control, only to find themselves right back in the trauma bond within weeks. Jung discovered this wasn't weakness on the victim's part. It was a sophisticated psychological trap that most people never see coming. Here's how Jung observed the power inversion crisis unfolds. Stage 1. The recognition. Narcissists have an uncanny ability to sense when their psychological hold is weakening. Jung found that they can detect changes in your energy, your confidence, your independence long before you're even fully aware of these changes yourself. You might notice them watching you more closely, asking probing questions about your activities, or seeming unusually interested in your emotional state. Jung called this dominant surveillance. They're unconsciously assessing whether you're still under their influence. Stage 2. The testing. Once they sense your growing strength, narcissists will test their remaining power over you. Jung observed that they'll deliberately trigger old patterns to see if you still react the same way. They might use a tone of voice that used to make you anxious, bring up topics that used to make you feel guilty, or make demands that you used to automatically comply with. If you respond differently, if you stay calm, set boundaries, or simply don't engage, they know something has fundamentally shifted. This is when Jung observed that panic sets into the narcissist's unconscious mind. Stage 3, the escalation. Jung discovered that narcissists will escalate their traditional manipulation tactics when they sense their control slipping. The gaslighting becomes more intense, the guilt trips become more elaborate, the emotional outbursts become more dramatic. But here's what Jung found remarkable. Strong people who have done healing work are often immune to these escalated tactics. You've learned to recognize gaslighting. You're no longer susceptible to guilt manipulation. You don't get pulled into their emotional chaos. This is actually the worst-case scenario for the narcissist's unconscious mind. Jung realized that when traditional manipulation fails, it triggers what he called narcissistic desperation, a psychological state where their unconscious will create increasingly severe situations to re-establish control. Stage 4, the final assessment. Jung observed that narcissists reach a critical decision point. They either accept the loss of control and move on to easier targets, or they deploy what Jung called the nuclear option, manufactured vulnerability. Most narcissists choose the nuclear option because losing a strong person represents more than just losing control over one individual. It represents proof that their power was always limited, that strong people can escape their influence, that their grandiose self-image might be false. Jung discovered that the narcissist's unconscious mind cannot tolerate this possibility, so it creates a situation designed to prove that their control was never really broken. It was just temporarily dormant. This is why Jung called it the final dirty trick. It's not just another manipulation tactic. It's a last-ditch psychological assault designed to destroy your confidence in your own strength and pull you back into the dynamic that nearly destroyed you. Jung's research revealed something that will chill you. Narcissists often sacrifice their own genuine well-being to execute this final manipulation. They'll sabotage their health, their relationships, their careers, anything to create a crisis that requires your caretaking. The manufactured vulnerability isn't just manipulation, it's psychological warfare designed specifically for people who think they're too strong to fall for manipulation anymore. Now I'm going to reveal Carl Jung's most disturbing discovery about narcissistic manipulation, the final dirty trick that has pulled thousands of strong people back into psychological slavery just when they thought they were free. Jung called it manufactured vulnerability, and once you see how it works, you'll recognize it everywhere. But more importantly, you'll never fall for it again. During his clinical research, Jung documented case after case of the same pattern. Just as someone was achieving true independence from a narcissist, just as they were building a life based on their authentic self, the narcissist would suddenly become fragile, desperate, and in desperate need of help. But here's what made Jung realize this wasn't coincidence. The timing was always perfect. The crisis always happened exactly when the victim was at their strongest, most confident, and most committed to their new boundaries. Jung discovered that manufactured vulnerability works through 3 precise psychological mechanisms. Mechanism 1: crisis creation. Narcissists unconsciously create real problems in their lives, specifically when their former victims are thriving. Jung found that they'll sabotage their own relationships, ignore their health until it becomes critical, make reckless financial decisions, or create workplace drama. The key insight Jung discovered: these aren't random, self-destructive behaviors. They're unconsciously calculated to create situations that require the specific type of help that only you can provide. If you're naturally nurturing, they'll create a situation where they need emotional support. If you're financially responsible, they'll create money problems. If you're good at solving problems, they'll create chaos that requires your organizational skills. Jung called this targeted crisis manufacturing. They unconsciously create the exact type of crisis that will activate your specific caretaking instincts. Mechanism 2: Strategic timing. Jung observed that narcissists have an almost supernatural ability to time these crises. They seem to know exactly when you're doing well, when you're feeling strong, when you're moving forward with your life. They'll contact you right after you've made a major positive change, achieved a personal goal, or reached a new level of confidence. Jung realized this timing isn't accidental, it's psychologically strategic. When you're feeling strong and successful, you're more likely to believe you can help them without getting pulled back in. When you're in a good place emotionally, you're more susceptible to feeling guilty about not helping someone in crisis. Jung called this strength exploitation, using your psychological strength against your psychological freedom. Mechanism. 3. Empathy. Weaponization. Jung's most chilling discovery was how manufactured vulnerability specifically targets empathetic people. Narcissists unconsciously understand that your empathy is both your greatest gift and your greatest vulnerability. They'll present their crisis in a way that makes you feel like you're the only person who truly understands them, the only one who can help them, the only one who cares enough to make a difference. Jung found that they'll often say things like, "You're the only person I can trust with this. I don't have anyone else to turn to," or "I know we've had our problems, but you're the only one who really knows me." This isn't just manipulation, it's empathy hijacking. They're using your capacity for compassion as a Trojan horse to re-establish psychological control. But here's where Jung's research gets truly sinister. Manufactured vulnerability often involves the narcissist genuinely suffering. They're not necessarily faking their crisis. They're creating real problems that cause them real pain, specifically to pull you back into their orbit. Jung realized that narcissists would rather suffer genuinely than lose control completely. They'll sacrifice their own well-being to maintain psychological dominance over strong people. This makes manufactured vulnerability incredibly difficult to resist because their pain is real, their crisis is legitimate, and your desire to help comes from a genuine place of compassion. Jung's warning was clear. Just because their crisis is real doesn't mean your involvement is necessary. Just because they're genuinely suffering doesn't mean you're responsible for their healing. The manufactured vulnerability works because it makes you feel like refusing to help makes you the bad person. But Jung discovered the opposite is true. Falling for manufactured vulnerability makes you complicit in your own psychological destruction. Carl Jung made a discovery about empathy that most people never want to hear. Your greatest gift can become your greatest weakness when weaponized by someone who understands how compassionate minds work. During his research on narcissistic manipulation, Jung encountered something that disturbed him deeply. The kindest, most compassionate people were often the ones who remained trapped the longest in toxic dynamics. It wasn't because they were weak, it was because their strength was being used against them. Jung identified what he called the empathy paradox. The same psychological qualities that make you capable of deep love, healing, and connection also make you vulnerable to specific types of manipulation that narcissists have unconsciously mastered. Here's how Jung observed the empathy trap works: the guilt activation. Jung discovered that narcissists have an unconscious ability to identify your guilt triggers with surgical precision. They know exactly what makes you feel responsible for other people's pain. During manufactured vulnerability, they'll activate these guilt triggers systematically. They might say things like, "I wouldn't be in this situation if you hadn't left. All I ever did was love you, and now look where I am." Or, "I guess I deserve to suffer alone." Jung called this guilt implantation, making you feel responsible for problems you didn't create and situations you can't actually control. The savior complex exploitation. Jung found that empathetic people often have what he called a healing instinct, a deep desire to help others overcome their suffering. Narcissists unconsciously exploit this instinct by presenting themselves as someone who can be saved if only you try hard enough. They'll make statements like, "You're the only person who's ever really understood me. With your help, I know I can change." Or, "I'm finally ready to get better, but I need your support." Jung realized that these statements specifically target your hope that your compassion can transform another person's life. But Jung discovered something chilling. Narcissists unconsciously present this hope while having no intention of actually changing. The unique bond illusion. Jung observed that during manufactured vulnerability, narcissists will emphasize the special connection between you. They'll claim that your relationship was unique, that no one else could possibly understand them the way you do, that your history together creates an obligation that transcends normal boundaries. Jung called this specialness exploitation, making you feel like normal rules don't apply to your situation because your connection is somehow different from everyone else's. The false progress promise. Jung discovered that narcissists instinctively understand that empathetic people are motivated by the possibility of positive change. During manufactured vulnerability, they'll often promise that this crisis is the turning point, that they're finally ready to address their problems, that things will be different this time. Jung found that these promises specifically exploit your hope while having no basis in reality. The narcissist's unconscious mind generates these promises not because they intend to follow through, but because they know hope is your psychological weakness. The isolation strategy. Jung observed that manufactured vulnerability often includes claims that you're their only option, that no one else cares about them, that they have nowhere else to turn. This isn't just manipulation. It's designed to make you feel like refusing help makes you responsible for their complete destruction. Jung called this responsibility inflation, making you feel accountable for outcomes that are actually beyond your control. But here's Jung's most important insight about the empathy trap. Your compassion isn't the problem. The problem is compassion without boundaries, empathy without discernment, love without self-protection. Jung discovered that truly strong people learn what he called discriminating compassion, the ability to feel empathy for someone's suffering without feeling responsible for their healing. You can acknowledge that their crisis is real without believing that you're the solution. You can feel sorry for their pain without sacrificing your freedom to alleviate it. You can care about their well-being without compromising your own. Jung's breakthrough insight was this: saying no to manufactured vulnerability isn't cruelty. It's the ultimate act of love for both yourself and the narcissist, because it refuses to enable their self-destructive patterns while protecting your authentic self. After decades of studying narcissistic manipulation, Carl Jung developed what he called the psychological independence framework, a systematic approach to protecting yourself from manufactured vulnerability and similar manipulations. Jung's framework isn't just about defense, it's about building unshakable psychological sovereignty. Jung realized that traditional advice about narcissistic abuse focuses too much on recognizing manipulation and not enough on building internal strength. His framework addresses this gap by developing what he called manipulator-proof psychology. Jung's first protection: differentiated compassion. Jung discovered that most people think compassion means being willing to sacrifice your well-being for someone else's. But Jung identified a more sophisticated form of compassion that he called differentiated compassion. Differentiated compassion means you can feel genuine empathy for someone's suffering without feeling responsible for solving their problems. You can acknowledge their pain without absorbing it. You can care about their well-being without compromising your own. Jung developed a specific technique for practicing differentiated compassion. When someone presents you with a crisis, ask yourself 3 questions. Can I help this person without violating my own boundaries? Am I the best person to provide this help, or am I just the most convenient? Will helping them genuinely serve their growth, or will it enable their dysfunction? If the answer to any of these questions is concerning, Jung advised that the most compassionate response is often to maintain your boundaries while connecting them with appropriate resources. Jung's second protection, the reality testing protocol. Jung observed that manufactured vulnerability works by creating artificial urgency and false scarcity. The narcissist presents their crisis as if you're their only option and immediate action is required. Jung developed what he called the reality testing protocol to counter this manipulation. First, ask for specific details about their crisis. Manufactured vulnerability often collapses under scrutiny because the narcissist hasn't actually thought through the practical aspects of their supposed emergency. Second, ask what other options they've considered. If they claim to have no other resources, that's usually a red flag. Most genuine crises have multiple potential solutions. Third, request time to consider your response. Manufactured vulnerability relies on emotional decision-making. When you take time to think rationally, the manipulation becomes more obvious. Jung found that narcissists often become agitated or hostile when you apply reality testing, which itself reveals the manufactured nature of their crisis. Jung's third protection, the individuation test. Jung's most powerful protection technique involves what he called the individuation test, evaluating every decision based on whether it serves your authentic development or prevents it. Jung believed that your highest responsibility is to become who you truly are. He called this individuation. Every time someone asks for your help, every time you're faced with a decision about how to respond to someone's crisis, Jung recommended applying the individuation test. Does this action support my journey toward authentic selfhood, or does it pull me back toward old patterns that prevented my growth? Jung found that manufactured vulnerability specifically targets your individuation process. The narcissist's unconscious goal isn't just to get help, it's to prove that you haven't really changed, that you're still the same person who can be controlled through emotional manipulation. When you apply the individuation test to manufactured vulnerability, the answer is always clear. Sacrificing your boundaries to rescue someone from problems they created for themselves is anti-individuation. It pulls you backward toward old patterns instead of forward toward authentic living. Jung's fourth protection, the sovereignty declaration. Jung's final protection technique involves what he called psychological sovereignty, the conscious declaration that you are not responsible for other adults' choices, feelings, or life outcomes. Jung found that people who fall for manufactured vulnerability often carry unconscious beliefs about being responsible for other people's happiness or well-being. The sovereignty declaration consciously rejects these beliefs. I am not responsible for your emotional state. I am not responsible for your life choices. I am not responsible for solving problems you created. I am responsible for my own growth, my own choices, and my own authentic development. Jung discovered that when you truly embody psychological sovereignty, manufactured vulnerability loses its power completely because it depends on you feeling responsible for outcomes that are actually beyond your control. Carl Jung's ultimate discovery about narcissistic manipulation was this: the goal isn't just to resist their final dirty trick, it's to become completely immune to all forms of psychological control. Jung called this achieving authentic selfhood, and he developed a specific protocol for people who want to become truly unmanipulable. Jung realized that most people who escape narcissistic relationships are still vulnerable to future manipulation because they haven't addressed the core psychological patterns that made them susceptible in the first place. His Freedom Protocol addresses these deeper vulnerabilities. Phase 1. Shadow integration for immunity. Jung discovered that people who fall for manipulation often have disowned parts of themselves that narcissists exploit. If you've disowned your anger, narcissists will use guilt to control you. If you've disowned your selfishness, they'll use shame to manipulate you. Jung's shadow integration process involves consciously reclaiming these disowned qualities in healthy ways. This doesn't mean becoming angry or selfish. It means integrating these energies so they can't be weaponized against you. Practice saying no without explaining yourself. Practice putting your needs first without feeling guilty. Practice expressing anger appropriately when your boundaries are violated. Jung found that when you integrate your shadow qualities, manipulation tactics that used to work become completely ineffective because you're no longer at war with those aspects of yourself. Phase 2. Authentic values. Clarification. Jung observed that manipulable people often live according to values that aren't truly their own. They've internalized other people's expectations, society's demands, or family programming without conscious evaluation. Jung's values clarification process involves identifying your authentic core values, not what you think you should value, but what actually matters to you when you're being completely honest. Write down your top 5 values without considering what others would approve of. Then evaluate every major relationship and commitment in your life against these values. Jung found that people who live according to authentic values become much harder to manipulate because they have internal reference points that can't be externally influenced. Phase 3. Psychological boundaries establishment. Jung discovered that most people think boundaries are about saying no to others, but true boundaries are about saying yes to yourself. They're about protecting your energy, time, and attention so you can invest them in what truly matters to you. Jung's boundary framework involves 3 levels. Physical boundaries protect your body, space, and time. You decide who gets access to your physical presence and under what conditions. Emotional boundaries protect your feelings and energy. You refuse to absorb other people's emotions or take responsibility for their psychological states. Spiritual boundaries protect your values and authentic development. You refuse to compromise your core principles or abandon your individuation journey for anyone's comfort. Jung found that people with strong boundaries in all 3 areas become essentially unmanipulable because they have clear internal guidelines that don't depend on external approval. Phase 4. Conscious relationship design. Jung's final phase involves consciously choosing relationships that support your authentic development rather than accepting relationships based on convenience, obligation, or old patterns. Jung developed specific criteria for conscious relationships. Do they support your growth or try to keep you the same? Do they respect your boundaries or constantly test them? Do they take responsibility for their own emotions or make you responsible for them? Do they encourage your authentic expression or pressure you to perform a false self? Jung found that when you apply these criteria consistently, you naturally attract relationships that nourish your authentic self while repelling people who would manipulate or control you. The Freedom Protocol isn't just about protecting yourself from narcissists. It's about becoming the kind of person who naturally attracts healthy relationships and repels unhealthy ones. Jung's ultimate insight was this: when you fully embody your authentic self, when you live according to your genuine values, when you maintain clear boundaries, and when you choose relationships consciously, manipulation becomes impossible because there's nothing false in you for manipulators to exploit. You become psychologically sovereign, free to be who you truly are without fear of losing approval or facing rejection, because your sense of self no longer depends on external validation. Here's Carl Jung's most powerful insight about the final dirty trick. It only works if you forget who you've become. Manufactured vulnerability depends on you believing that you're still the same person who needed them, who felt responsible for their happiness, who would sacrifice your authenticity to maintain their approval. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. The moment you refuse to fall for manufactured vulnerability, you complete your psychological transformation. You prove, to yourself and to them, that their power over you was always an illusion. Their desperation to manipulate you isn't evidence of their strength. It's proof of your freedom. And once you see manufactured vulnerability for what it really is, a last desperate attempt to reclaim control they never actually had, you realize that you've already won. Your assignment is simple but life-changing. The next time someone presents you with a crisis that conveniently coincides with your strength, apply Jung's reality testing protocol. Ask for details, explore their other options, and take time before responding. Remember, Jung discovered that your greatest protection against manipulation isn't building walls. It's building such a strong, authentic self that nothing false can penetrate your psychological sovereignty. You are not responsible for other adults' choices, feelings, or life outcomes. You are only responsible for your own individuation, becoming who you truly are. Write in the comments, "I choose sovereignty." Let's build a community of psychologically free people who understand that our empathy is a gift to be honored, not a weakness to be exploited. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about psychological freedom, check out my video on "You're not overthinking, you're just seeking clarity," where I reveal that everything you've been told about overthinking is wrong. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.